Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with yet another episode of Path to Victory. Now, it's been a bit of time since the last one. I was very busy last month with the Alberta election, so I didn't really have too much time to do as many of these as I would have liked. But we're here once again. Now, just as a refresher for anyone who's new to the series, or for people who might have just forgotten the color scheming or the intention of this series, what is happening here is I am mapping out by region across Canada seats for mostly reference to a potential conservative majority. In other words, their target seats. So the more blue it is here, the more core this seat is, the more they cannot afford to lose this to win a majority. The more red it is, the more likely that no matter what they could possibly do, the Liberals would still win, or the NDP. They are combined in this one because I do not ever see a scenario here where the NDP will prop up a conservative minority over the Liberals. I don't think it's ever going to happen. And since I do not see that ever happening, I'm combining them here for simplicity. It makes it easier to see what's going on if we only consider two camps, because we're only in this series discussing a conservative majority. What are their target seats? What seats are they competitive in? What seats could they pick up? So these very light red seats are ones that they could theoretically take from the Liberals, or in places like Quebec, the Bloc could take from the Liberals. But it is not likely, or in other words, I do not think it is expected that they will. Or you should expect it. The Bloc is also here because the Bloc could go either way. I don't think you can easily lump them with the Liberals or the Conservatives. It depends on what they are given policy-wise for government support in a minority. But with that, let us start with today's video. Rural Ontario, and this will really conclude Eastern Canada proper, and we will only have two regions left: Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. And I'm only breaking those two out because Manitoba and Saskatchewan individually are too small for one episode, and all three together is too big. But we are on Ontario, rural Ontario today. So, what is rural Ontario looking like? It's actually a fairly interesting region. It's a region more so than any other one in the country that is shifting wildly against the Liberals. Yes, you can say here there is some gain over time with the NDP. If you look at the start of the series or start of the time period in the early 90s, 2000s, the reform era, the NDP is maybe around 8%. And now they're in the Trudeau era, we're looking at 18%. So there has been a substantial growth of the NDP in rural Ontario. But conversely, in the Chrétien era, which I think is a better name to say this, I'm going to do this by prime ministers, the Liberals were at like 48%, give or take. And now in the Trudeau era, especially the later Trudeau era, we're looking at 30%. That's pretty substantial movement. And if you look in raw vote total, here we're looking at maybe 650,000 votes. And we're actually, probably little G's there, we're actually in a similar ballpark. They have a similar number of votes. What has happened in rural Ontario, what it seems to be based off their vote share and their vote distribution, it hasn't been that they've lost voters. They just have failed to gain new voters. In fact, their base in rural Ontario, I would suspect if we could do proper polling, which maybe one day in the future I can do, but for now I do not have the finances, I would suspect the Liberal base in rural Ontario is old. Like 50 plus range. And the younger you get, the more conservative it likely is. And also the more NDP it is. Though more NDP it is, it's kind of a given. That's just true everywhere. So as time goes on here, it is very likely that this region is going to progressively and consistently get more and more conservative, because the Conservatives are gaining oodles of voters. In 2021, they had 888,000 voters, the record performance in rural Ontario, period. At the same time, they had 159,000 PPC votes, which is, again, one of the reasons why I have said before, and I will continue to say, the PPC is not really splintering votes from the Conservatives. That is a wrong way to look at this. The PPC is in 2021 and 2019 turned out voters that probably were not going to ever vote Conservative. They likely turned out a lot of voters who didn't vote before, and they got defectors from all other parties as well. Now, I'm not going to say that there weren't Conservatives who went to vote PPC. That almost certainly did happen. But you can't look at this growth from 2019 to 2021 and see the 110,000 new PPC voters and conclude the Conservatives lost 110,000 votes. They gained 83,000 votes. 43,000 votes. Apologies. So you can't conclude that. Maybe in a timeline where O'Toole was more right-wing, he could have got those 110,000 votes, but that seems unlikely. Beating out past performances by nearly 200,000 seems very implausible. What's more likely is that without the PPC, those voters wouldn't have voted. They'd be disengaged. And I think there is something to be said that a lot of them seem to be coming from the Greens. The Greens were a anti-establishment party, and a lot of those voters switched PPC. You can even see it in the percentages. These almost mirror each other, 2019 to 2021. And I would not be surprised if you look at it on a riding by riding, poll by poll basis in 2025. If you see the PPC lose votes and the Greens gain almost the same number of votes in 2025, assuming that is the next election. So this is the overall story in votes. The Conservatives have gained votes substantially. The Greens have occasionally gained lots of votes, but occasionally regressed down to a fairly low number of votes. So it's kind of hard to really gauge where the Greens are. NDP are gaining ground, but it's not useful. This is a very inefficient NDP vote distribution. It is very heavily concentrated. Sorry, not concentrated. It's very heavily diffuse. It's not even very concentrated in Northern Ontario, which is their best region, which we'll get into in a bit. But now for the general overview, let us discuss the first region, Eastern Ontario, and we will just highlight what we define by Eastern here. This is what I'm referring to as Eastern Ontario. Now, I think technically speaking, if we really wanted to be robust, Ottawa is included, but I've already broken out Ottawa separately, so this is rural Eastern Ontario. So what's the deal with rural Eastern Ontario? Well, similar story to the rest of Ontario. There's been a huge increase, almost monotonically, except for 2015, in the Conservative vote share here. In the Great Chen era, we're looking at maybe 140,000 votes. And now in the Trudeau era, we're looking at 190, 200,000 range. Very substantial. Whereas the Liberals if we look at the last 2 elections of Chrétien, about 150 and now about 160, that's pretty flat. They're not actually gaining voters here, per se. In fact, their best performance in 2015 is not too dissimilar to Chrétien's in 1993. Once again, the NDP are gaining ground here, but in a very inefficient, diffuse way where there is really no chance of a breakthrough seat anywhere. If we look at general partisan tilt, and we've excluded other here, though I think you could reasonably add other to the right column, but it's not always clear where independents go. But generally speaking, other parties are usually right wing, such as Christian Heritage or the Libertarian Party, the two biggest sixth parties in Ontario, and especially in rural Ontario. But for now, we're just excluding other because this also includes independents who are more complicated. But if we look at this, the partisan tilt of this region of Eastern Ontario, you see in the Chrétien era is about 54% left, 46 or so right. And now we're looking at 47 right, 53 left. Actually hasn't changed dramatically yet. It's looking, though, depending on how this PPC holds out in the next election and or how the Conservatives do, it might be trending more conservative in just actual partisan tilt here. It's not for certain, but it's looking like that is the case. As you see here, we have 3 straight elections of net gains. And even back in the Harper era, we were looking at majority right tilt. It seems to be the case here. But that doesn't mean this entire region is what you would call safe. But let us begin with what is safe. So we have, to begin with, Stormont, Dundas, South Glengarry here. This is the safest region in all of Ontario for the Conservatives. It is nearly unthinkable that they could lose this seat, period. Then we have Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes, also nearly unthinkable. Most of the rest of these, like Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke, Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston, Hastings, Lennox, and Addington, and Bay of Quinte, are what you would call core. It's not unthinkable. They have lost them in the past. In fact, they've lost most of these in the past, to be fair, under the Chrétien time period. But at this point in time, they're not as safe as those other two, but they are, in theory, losable. And I realize I've colored Kingston in here, and that was incorrect. Kingston is, to get to it, it is this color. It is almost perfectly safe Liberal. There has been a couple times in the past where it was somewhat close, but it seems exceedingly unlikely at this point that you could ever reasonably see the Liberals lose it. It could happen, but it almost certainly won't. And then the final one we have, this is an interesting one. Glengarry, Prescott, Russell. This is a riding that the Conservatives have historically not done particularly well in. I believe it is very francophone, and that has usually hurt the Conservatives in it. But right now, it's looking like, with the numbers we're looking at and the campaign we're seeing happen, that this should be a riding you would expect the Conservatives to win. If this is a riding they fail to win, it's not the end of the world, but it is the type of riding they seem to be targeting. you should expect to see them at least hope to win it. And it is winnable for them. Quite comfortably winnable to them. Will it actually be winnable? We'll see. But it's like other of these light blue ridings. They don't need to win all of them, but they do need to win the majority. To get a majority, that is. Then we have Central Ontario, and I guess to get this highlighted. Now, the borders of Central Ontario, I'm not super enthused about. Some of these, like these two here, maybe you could put them in Southern Ontario, or sorry, Western Ontario. Maybe some of these could be in Eastern. The borders are kind of confusing. The core of Simcoe Barrie area is pretty obvious. That is clearly Central Ontario. It's just what counts the edges. A bit less clear, but it doesn't particularly matter. These ones have ended up being grouped because they seem the most similar riding-wise, but if they're not, whatever. You want to disagree, comment below, by all means. But this is what I decided. Now, this area is kind of the same story as the last ones. With the really only exception compared to Eastern is that O'Toole had a huge bump here. He gained nearly 20,000 votes. And overall, this region is perhaps more comfortably conservative. And I think you can also sort of see this with the NDP's recent performance in it. If you compare this to Eastern, the NDP has done, let's say, about 15.5%. And here they're about 14%. The NDP's a touch weaker here. The Liberals are about the same spot, maybe 1% or so lower. It's very similar, but just slightly more conservative, which is interesting because unlike Eastern Ontario, this does actually have a fairly substantial city, which is Barrie, in it. And usually the more substantial of a city you have, the more left does better. Urban areas tend to be more fiscally liberal. Not necessarily more socially liberal, but definitely more fiscally liberal. There is just more things you might want the government to spend money on in a city. But this region is actually very homogenous. Unlike the last one, Eastern Ontario, where there was a few ridings that were slightly different, that's just not really the case here. There's really only one riding that is meaningfully different. The rest of these are what you would call core. Once again, the only one that's slightly different is Peterborough Kawartha. And even then, and that's the wrong color. It's supposed to be this one. And even Peterborough Kawartha is very comfortable. It's not completely inconceivable that this could go Liberal, but it seems exceedingly unlikely. Especially in the majority. Not inconceivable, though. It has happened recently. It was the last one in this region that the Liberals held, and they only lost it in 2021, just barely. Now, I suspect, as an incumbent, Michelle Ferreri should comfortably and easily win re-election in 2025, but this does make it slightly more competitive, depending on what the Liberals do. Next here, we get the Western Ontario. And I guess to just do the same stuff here, we will highlight. This is what I'm calling Western Ontario. And the general dividing line I just chose between these two, for the record, it is based off of actual riding characteristics, but It generally seems to be this line seems like the best line for it, because it's really, for lack of a better word, it's like relative PPC performance does better south of this line. I don't know why, but this line seems to be where the PPC starts doing substantially better in Ontario. And that's kind of what you see in this region. Notice the fish one here. Here, Eastern 6%, 6.8%, 10.5% in Western. It is substantially higher for the rest of Southern Ontario. And it actually puts this particular region in 2021 extremely right-wing for Ontario. 57% right tilt, which is quite surprising. Like, yes, it is rural areas, and all of the cities have basically been removed from this sample of writings. But even the cities are quite right, or PPC strong, if you recall the small city Ontario video. And it is actually interesting too, because again, like every other region here, the Liberals did much better in the 90s and have done a lot worse now. But it feels more relevantly substantial here. We're still talking at the similar ballpark, especially if we make this a bit bigger so you can see it a bit easier. We have the same ballpark here in the 90s of like maybe 46%, similar to the other two regions. But unlike these other two who are in the low 30s now, we're now looking at like 24, 25% for the Liberals. The Conservatives sitting more comfortably around 47%, which is higher than the other two regions as well. It is substantially moved. You look in the 90s, the Conservatives started getting 175, give or take, and now they're getting 250. That doesn't sound as good as Central until you consider the fact that Central has a turnout of 630,000 versus 540. So for much fewer voters, they're getting a very similar vote share. If there is any region in Ontario, rural Ontario that is, that you would ever expect PPC to gain in, it would be this one. Though, after the mediocre performance in the Oxford by-election recently, it's debatable whether that will actually be the case. Maybe it's just by-elections or by-elections. Maybe not. But that definitely does note something interesting in this region. The other corollary interesting thing of this region is the NDP is actually fairly strong here. Now, that actually shouldn't surprise you too much. Yes, this is mostly rural areas, but some of the places, if we go move this off to the side, such as around London here, or on the outskirts of Essex, or the outskirts of Kitchener, Hamilton, these are near big industrial manufacturing areas. And I don't know the exact economy of every single riding, but I would not be surprised if you told me that there's actually meaningful amounts of manufacturing in a bunch of these ridings. I believe it was Mad Beast Yeti who described, in one of the comments in the past video, described, generally speaking, small city Ontario, but I would possibly extend more to southern Ontario as the Canadian Rust Belt. And I think that is a very accurate and useful way to look at this, because if we look at these numbers, where are the PPC doing best? In generally former manufacturing places, because those kind of areas that have been taking heavy hits, such as manufacturing industry, tend to be more populist, and it has yielded better results for the PPC. So what is this to say? Well, if we are to color this map, first off, this entire area is pretty safe, but you have two groups. So you have this like southern point, triangle, we'll call it, and that's almost unthinkable. The only party who really, I think, has a chance of taking any of those ridings, barring the Conservatives doing something obscenely stupid, is the PPC, and that is so incredibly unlikely. And even then, if the PPC win a seat there, the PPC are more likely to support a conservative government than a liberal one, just like the NDP are more likely to support liberal than the conservatives. So the worst case scenario for the conservatives here is they get a party who's more likely to vote, who will likely vote for confidence for them. So that's what you get. A couple of these other ones, like such as Haldimand Norfolk, is also very, very safe, as is Huron Bruce. These other ones here, such as Brantford, Perth Wellington, and Oxford, are much closer. Now, some people might argue that perhaps I should have Oxford much more closer to this color. I'm not really one to think that Oxford by-election is meaningful. I don't really think the Conservatives are going to be that close to the Liberals come actual 2023 or 2025 election. It's not impossible, but I just don't really think that's going to happen. So with that, we now move into Northern Ontario. And I think we can all guess what Northern Ontario is. I don't even need to really color it. Now, Northern Ontario is interesting. There's also the debate on what counts as boundaries, and is Parry Sound Muskoka part of Northern Ontario? I don't know. But we're including it. Now let's look. Northern Ontario, unlike the other ones, cannot be described as anything but a generally left-leaning area. The best performances the Conservatives and or the right in general have gotten was 2021 and 2011. Not great. But I think we can say this region is drifting conservative. We saw it in the provincial election in Ontario in 2022. Doug Ford did quite well in Northern Ontario. In fact, very well. You just look at the last 3 years, and we see about a 5-point gain, then a 9-point gain. Substantial. That puts 2019 and 2021 as the first and third best performances, period. Once you discount the 90s, because the 90s are a bit more complicated. If you include the 90s, then it's fourth and first. Very substantial. If you look at... There's definitely something wrong here, but I'm not going to bother fixing that. So, actually, no, I will. Bear with me 1 second. Okay, I have returned. And we have fixed data. Don't worry about it. I was grabbing the wrong data. But to get back to the main gist here, we can kind of see sort of what has happened in Northern Ontario. So we look at the Libs first. We look at the last 2 years of the Crate-Shannon period, because 93 is kind of an anomalous election. We're not going to really look at that too much. About 190,000 votes. Martin and First Harper, about 160,000 votes. Last two of Trudeau, 140. We are seeing monotonic decline when you look at these periods and you exclude anomalous elections. 93, 11, 8, 15. You exclude those, and you're seeing this decline. 2015 is actually kind of interesting case study on this, because it kind of suggests and shows, which the turnout figures actually also help you indicate, that the Liberals lost a lot of voters to apathy, to not voting. And Trudeau turned them out in 2015, and then it immediately crashed down in 19 and 21. Now, conversely, the Conservatives were about 115, across the entire of the Great Qin years. And this is PC and Reform combined, for the record. Then we took a nosedive a bit, or they took a nosedive a bit, in 2004-06 and Martin First Harper, about 100,000. But now the last two of Trudeau, we're now looking at about 130. So there was a decline in this region, and now it's going back up on the rise. And actually 2021 is almost matching the 2011 performance with 31,000 going PPC. A substantial breakoff. Now the NDP, this is the final one that actually is quite interesting here. They had terrible numbers in the 90s. Let's say 70-ish thousand, you could say, is their average. Pretty terrible performance. Because they were doing better before the 90s, and they did worse after the 90s. They just did terrible in the 90s. They peaked a bit under Layton, about 130 in the early Harper years. But now, if you look at these two, you look at 2015 under Mulcair, the first of Layton, and you look at all of these, and it's kind of suggesting that they're about 115-ish. And they seem to be stuck around that number. And that puts them roughly around 27-ish% of the popular vote, give or take. So they've definitely flatlined. The green numbers are kind of all over the place, and it's not really worth discussing. So the Conservatives have some momentum here. The Liberals are actively having no momentum. And barring a charismatic leader like Layton pulling in, it seems like the NDP really tread water around 115 plus or minus 5. Not particularly good. This actually makes the region, paradoxically, a very good one to gain ground in for the Conservatives. They generally do fairly mediocre here. And it's not a very leaning Conservative region. But there is a very strong Liberal NDP vote split. The Liberal vote is softening, and the Conservative vote seems to be gaining, especially if someone like Poilievre can take a bunch of these PPC votes, then a lot of these ridings look very competitive. So what do we got? Well, one second. So what do we got here? Well, the first one, Parry Sound, Muskoka. It's conceivable that they could lose it, but it's probably not ever going to happen. And then the other one here, very similar, is Kenora. It's conceivable they could lose it, the Conservatives, but probably not going to happen. And those are the two core Conservative seats here. It's very, very hard to imagine them losing those. Then we have an interesting pairing. We have a Gloma-Mantalin. Oops, I don't know why I did this. So a Gloma-Mantalin here, which should be fairly safe for the NDP. They're not guaranteed to keep it. Their Conservatives are close enough and the margin of error is high enough that they could win this, especially if we could get some regional polls to actually make it more clear where the Conservatives are gaining ground. This could happen, but it seems unlikely. And then we have its neighbor, Thunder Bay Superior North, which is the same shtick. It's not impossible. It could happen, but we don't really expect it. And then we have two, what I would call interesting ones. We have Timmins, James Bay, and we have Sudbury. Both of these are very close. But Timmins James Bay, I suspect, is close in an anomalous way. I suspect Timmins is now very conservative, and or at PPC. But a lot of the other parts, the indigenous areas, the mining settlements and stuff like that, are more still NDP. I might call them ancestral NDP voters, who probably will only be NDP while Charlie Angus is there. As soon as he retires, this will almost certainly become a conservative riding. It's very much a case where I think the MP himself is holding the riding. And there's not many of those. There are some, it does happen. But usually the MP themselves is not super impactful. Here, though, it definitely is. Then we have another pairing of seats. So we have Sault Ste. Marie, which was barely lost by the Conservatives in 21. Seems almost impossible they could lose it again if they were to form a majority. It could happen, because it's very close, and this is Northern Ontario where the Conservatives aren't the strongest. But they were so close in 21, they're almost certainly going to win this. Similarly, we have Thunder Bay, Superior North. Sorry. Thunder Bay, Rainy River. Over here. Similar story. Very close in 21. Seems almost impossible that they could win a majority and lose this next time around. And provincially, Doug Ford handily won this riding. So, maybe not handily, but he won this riding comfortably. Seems very likely then that the Conservatives could follow suit and do that. Especially they can recruit the provincial MP. That could also work quite handily. It's not guaranteed they could recruit him, but that would make it easier. And then we have Nipissing, Timiskaming, apologies on pronunciation, and Nickelbelt. These two are interesting. I think they slightly tilt conservative, but there is a good chance they don't win these ridings. They could. I think they will. I believe if you look at my model right now, they are winning both of them. Look at my last update. Actually, heck, we could just get that up here. Yeah, they are winning both of them in my model right now. But I don't think, because of the fact that this is Northern Ontario, and this has not always been historically the strongest region for Conservatives, that it should be taken for granted. We're not talking about something like, I'm trying to think of an example here. Actually, it doesn't really look like, it's less likely than Sault Ste. Marie. Let's just put it that way. But that generally seems to sum up where we have rural Ontario. And if we go to the national scoreboard here, this puts us at the end of rural Ontario here. 117 seats for the Conservatives, 126 for the Liberals as expected wins. Or, another way to put this is, these are the battleground areas. And you do need to flip some of the ones from the other camp to get a majority here. That's basically guaranteed. Not entirely, but it's likely. Because again, if you look at the rest of Canada, I don't have the numbers here, but if you look at the rest of the stuff, the Conservatives are going to be sitting around like 173 or give or take. So they will still win if they win all of these seats. But they probably want to win some of these light red ones for comfort reasons. Or potentially some of these light blue ones. But with that, I'll bid you all adieu. Oh, actually, I should do my YouTube stuff. I hate doing this. This is so cringe, but it works, so I'm going to do it. If you liked the video, by all means, like, share, subscribe, comment below what you think. If you think I missed anything, if you think anything I've done is silly or dumb or whatever you want to call it. If you made any mistakes, perhaps. If you want to see something going forward, by all means, say that as well. But otherwise, I'm going to bid you adieu here, and I will see you next week with a different video.